Thanks very much, Jean, and I want again to thank you, my old and cherished friend and distinguished colleague, for making possible. Well, hello? Can you hear now? Okay, I'm going to repeat what I said because it's important. I want to thank my very distinguished friend and colleague for many years, Jean Emmanuel, for facilitating my coming to this Congress. And can I just say that this great country of Zimbabwe has been fortunate in having a person like him to contribute to global transfusion. I've been told to use this. Okay, I'll use this, whatever. All right, so I'll just whistle up the first slide. Okay, I'm going to start with, as is my wont, some philosophizing by stating what I think is the obvious, but which in many blood transfusion meetings tends to be somewhat overlooked. I want to propose that the sole purpose of healthcare is to alleviate suffering and postpone death. Obviously, we can't prevent death. We're all going to die. And all appearances to the contrary, this is also the sole purpose of blood transfusion and blood product therapies. This, somehow or other, seems to have become a controversial statement. I don't understand how. Therefore, all matters related to this field are secondary to clinical and patient interests. And the objective needs for patients are central, primary, and overarching. We live in the age of so-called patient-centered outcomes research and patient-centered medical care. And this is what this means, that healthcare is there for patients, no other reason. Everything else flows from that. And that's going to be the subject of my talk. I want to immediately specify, delineate the important differences between transfusion fresh blood components and medicinal plasma protein therapies. They're summarized on this slide, and basically we can see differences related to the manufacture, but most importantly, and something which I have been interested for many, many years, is the issue of evidence. It is very good that we are now in the era where the evidence base for blood components is being questioned, is being augmented, and practice is actually starting to shift on the basis of the fact that the blowtorch of evidence-based medicine is being applied to transfusion mainstream components. This has been always the case for plasma-derived therapies. Plasma-derived therapies cannot be put on the market unless a specific company proves to a regulatory agency that the indication for which it is seeking approval to be put on the market is evidence-based. So, ipso facto, plasma-derived medicines immediately have an edge in relation to evidence related to their use. And I think that this is extremely important to understand. Now, let's talk about the clinical need, because everything stems from the patient. The plasma industry has gone through successions of so-called demand drivers. For 40 years, after Edwin Cohn, God rest his soul, developed albumin, this was the primary driver. Then, because of the developments in understanding cryoprecipitation through Judith Poole at the blood bank level, this was taken up at an industrial scale in the late 60s, and over the 1970s, plasma-derived factor VIII became the demand driver. In the 1980s, this started to fade as immunoglobulin started to be better understood in terms of its potential when administered in high doses. Technology, which wasn't available before, allowed it to be administered in high dosage, and therefore immunoglobulin became the plasma driver. This is in our established economies in the West. It is by no means necessarily the case that this is prevalent throughout the whole world. So at the moment, in the established economies, the driver is immunoglobulin, and we are still undergoing this huge controversy on the usage of immunoglobulin. I shall say something about this, which is covered by the so-called myth, in my opinion, of off-label use. So let us talk about the evidence level for immunoglobulin indications. This is from the QADI, the American Academy of Allergy, Asthma and Immunology. And this shows the main usages of immunoglobulin in the United States and also in the established economies. You've got first the established immunodeficiency states, whether they're primary or secondary, and then you've got the autoimmune diseases, primarily the neurological conditions. And you can see that the evidence level for all of these is extremely high. So there's no question here of wastage when the product is used for these indications. And when people talk about people using immunoglobulin like water, this is arrant nonsense. The vast bulk, more than 95% of usage of IgG is used for the indications which you can see on the slide. I'm going to show you some more data. But first of all, I want to continue exploring the issue of demand. This is from a recent study, which I participated in, from the University of North Carolina, assessing the evidence-based clinical demand of immunoglobulin, not for anything controversial, but for primary immune deficiency. This is primary immune deficiency, what Brian showed you in his slides. So this is people who definitely need the product. And this is using so-called decision analysis to derive a figure for the evidence-based clinical demand for these diseases. The evidence-based clinical demand is 72 grams per 1,000 population. This is more than most of the countries of the so-called European Union are using now. Now, does this mean that other countries are using it wastefully? No, it simply means that many countries in the European Union are rationing systematically their patients and under-treating. And we have strong evidence for this. Diagnosis is not being optimized, reimbursement systems are all over the place, and people are not being treated. 72 grams per 1,000 just for PID. And the end is not yet in sight, and this, of course, like most matters in academic medicine, is still under debate and controversial, but in a meta-analysis, Jordan Orange, an opinion leader in immunology treatment in the United States, showed that if you continue to increase dosages over and above what are currently prescribed, you get better clinical outcomes in terms of the pneumonia incidence in the patients, number of incidents per year. Though this is somewhat contested by Isabella Quinti, a collaborator with whom I do research in Rome, who maintains that you get a leveling off. But even then, the leveling off is higher than the trough levels currently recommended by the guidelines. So like everything else in clinical medicine, as we improve the access to care, we can improve therapeutic outcomes. I come from a country which is very rich. I admit it. I don't know that we need to make too many excuses about it, but we are very rich. And we use a lot of immunoglobulin. We are the third highest users in the world. This is very controversial. However, let me tell you that despite this, it is very strictly allocated. It is allocated on the basis of evidence. First of all, we have only one purchaser, the government, and therefore the government makes damn sure that the immunoglobulin only goes to the indications which have very high levels of evidence. This high level of evidence is based upon medical advice given directly to the blood authority, which actually buys the immunoglobulin. And you can see it over here. This is showing you the proportion of immunoglobulin which is allocated every year. It keeps going up and up and up, and they are all level 1 indications. There is no wastage here. We are now consuming 150 grams per 1,000 population, and I am very confident that this still represents underusage. As diagnosis improves and medical care improves, usage will continue to go up until we actually deal with all the patients. Let's continue talking about Australia, since it's one of the few places in the world in which I know anything about. It's very good that the National Blood Authority in Australia publishes this data, which is all available on the internet through their annual reports. You can see that, as I said, the consumption of IG keeps going up. The amount produced domestically cannot keep up with the consumption, despite huge efforts and massive investment funded by the Australian government, including my taxes, to the blood service to generate more and more plasma. And one thing which I want to point out, which I'm coming to as a major plank in this talk, is that at the moment we are fractionating in Australia about 500 tons of plasma. We are, as I shall show, the highest producer of plasma for fractionation in the world from the unpaid sources. And now more than half of this is from apheresis. And this is one of the key messages which I seek to impart, that if one wants to assume any level of sufficiency for clinical care of plasma-derived products from any source, plasmapheresis is a necessity. It is not an option. It is a necessity. This is a hard message, because the financial imposts because of plasmapheresis are high. But this, I believe, is a paradigm which can be broken. In conjunction with that, we see in Australia, and again, this is a slide taken directly from the NBA report, including the interesting trend line, that as in most of the established systems, as I spoke about 2 days ago, we have a continuous trend in decrease in actual consumption of red blood cells and need for whole blood. And this is very, very important, I think, because this has obvious implications on the ability to generate recovered plasma. Even if we go on with this crazy paradigm of squeezing every last drop of plasma from collected whole blood, the number of actual red cells needed is decreasing. As I said, the blowtorch of evidence is applied to red cell transfusion. Now let's make a few calculations. How much plasma is actually needed? Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the consumption in Australia, Canada, and the United States is legitimate. I would continue to assert that this is the case. And we need about 150 grams of immunoglobulin per 1,000 population. Let's assume that the immunoglobulin yield is about 5 grams per liter of plasma. This is the case with the Australian fractionator. They're very efficient. We therefore see that the immunoglobulin need can be met through 30 liters of plasma from 1,000 population. You can do the calculations yourself on your own. I believe you'll find that this justifies this figure. And incidentally, this will also generate a very handsome amount of factor VIII, 6 IUs per capita from the plasma, if you're not recombinantly inclined, as most countries in the West now are. Where does this come? Where is this going to come from? So the options are we can recover it from blood donations, or we can source it from plasmapheresis. If we recover it, if we say we're going to recover all our plasma needs and we're going to drive the system on the basis of plasma needs through recovered plasma, we're going to end up over-collecting to a ludicrous fashion and wasting enormous amounts of red cells and putting donors of whole blood systematically in the way of deliberate harm. Now, of course, this figure of 126 units of whole blood per 1,000 is grossly exaggerated. Nobody's doing that. But I'm afraid that there is a philosophical underpinning to much of the thinking in this area in the social market-based blood systems, which is actually conducive to this. And let me tell you, I worked myself 25 years ago in the Australian blood system, and this was in the good old days before we proceeded to lose most of our donors through ridiculous nonsense like variant CJD deferrals and so on and so forth. In those days, we had more red cells than we knew what to do with, and we systematically collected blood in order to get the plasma for fractionation. There's no question about this. This was policy. And this is policy which is detrimental to donor and patient alike. And I want to talk now briefly about the global financial crisis of the so-called developed blood sector. Because, as I said, the amount of red cell transfusion is going down. And in the United States, where everything is based upon the so-called market, this is having a big effect, even in the so-called not-for-profit blood sectors. And this is just one particular story from the popular press. You can find several of these as time goes by, in which blood banks, based upon not-for-profit principles in the United States, are basically going bankrupt because of the fact that people are not transfusing as much blood. This, of course, is a very good thing. Not that they're going bankrupt, I personally couldn't care less, but that people are not transfusing so much blood, because it means that patient blood management is starting to bite. And we have got to resist the tendency to deplore this purely on the basis of the economic interests of the so-called not-for-profit sector. Now, I spoke about this, and I'm going to just summarize it 2 days ago. As I said, red cell usage is plunging. Recovered plasma production is decreasing. I'm going to be repeating Brian's slides in just a moment. I can't remember whether I gave him his slides or he gave mine, but it doesn't matter. Recovered plasma is inherently more difficult to control in a regulatory fashion than source plasma. This is definitely the case. I myself was a regulator for many years. The blood bank sector was an infinitely bigger headache than the fractionation sector. And in the United States, the FDA has solved the problem of regulating recovered plasma by simply not doing it. So let's not talk about differential safety. Most of the indications for red cell transfusion, as I hope I discussed 2 days ago, are best met through whole blood. And tying the blood service to the generation of plasma for fractionation is inimical to mainstream transfusion demands. This is a bad thing. blood transfusion, and blood should be collected for mainstream transfusion purposes in hospitals. You've already seen this slide. The trend is inexorable. The commercial sector increases while the not-for-profit sector decreases. And this is because governments are getting out. It is as simple as that. All over the world, the social market health economies which had a fractionation capacity have decreased. In the course of my career, Australia privatized its fractionator. The United Kingdom went through an enormously complicated and torturous process which has finally resulted in the British fractionator being privatized. 15 years after they decided not to collect plasma for fractionation anymore. Canada the same, Norway, Denmark, everywhere around the world except for a few organizations which hang on through a complex nexus of arrangements. But the trend is inexorable. Think about what would happen, as Brian O'Mahony said, if that green bar was removed from the system as is being advocated by the so-called Rome Declaration. It would result in 85% of patients not having treatment overnight. Thank you very much. Same again. You can see that the trend is inexorable towards source rather than recovered plasma. And this again is one of our common promiscuous slides, which shows you that basically the compensation of donors increases the amount of plasma. And I just want to make one point in relation to the slide which Brian didn't make. And this is that the 4 countries which you see in the top level of source plasma collection are also very high in the level of whole blood collection. In other words, people in these countries donate plasma and get paid for it, and also donate blood and obviously not get paid for it. Now, the demographics are actually very different, but this negates the argument, which keeps being made ad nauseum by people like the WHO without any evidence whatsoever that there is a so-called crowding out phenomenon. There isn't. The evidence is that there isn't. There is no crowding out. I think I showed this picture before, and my distinguished friend is in the front row, so I won't belabor the point. But of course, the association for which I work does promote the importance of commercial plasmapheresis. But let me tell you something, my friends. No company which pays donors is doing this out of the goodness of its heart. It's doing it because if we don't pay the donors, we don't get the plasma. If we don't get the plasma, we don't get the products. If we don't get the products, patients die. If you can devise some way that the 1 million United States-based source plasma donors can give that plasma for free, tell us about it. Because then the profits will increase. And that's what we're there for, isn't it? We're there to make profits. Thank you very much. We undoubtedly have no doubt at all. The evidence is strong. If we do not pay donors, they won't turn up. Plasmapheresis is not whole blood collection. And unfortunately, the world does depend on intense plasmapheresis. And I just want to make another point, because this is a dangerous situation. And I do have some resonance to the self-sufficiency arguments, but this is a dangerous situation that we depend on US plasma. But every time the commercial sector tries to extend the collection of plasma to other countries, it is systematically undermined and sabotaged by other interest groups. And this is a bad thing. So I just want to conclude by reflection. They're not actually conclusions. I reiterate, the clinical demand for the products is driven by the needs for patients, by evidence-based medicine, of whom I am a passionate advocate. Latent demand is not met by the current consumption. We are going to keep on needing more. And plasma is needed irrespective of the procurement method, whether it is coming from recovered or source, doesn't matter. It can result in good products. However, the developments in transfusion are decreasing the amount of whole blood and red cells delivered. Whole blood, I maintain, is a preferred modality for many red cell needs. Source plasma continues to dominate for the reasons I've outlined, procurement. And compensation is required for its adequate harvesting. If it wasn't the case, we wouldn't be doing it. And there's no evidence that compensating plasma donors affects the mainstream blood system. And I just want to say as my final remark in this conference and this magnificent setting that I would hope that all of us chose this profession for one reason and one reason alone. It's given us good careers. It's allocated to us a living in various nexuses. It's generated a huge empire, 7 journals just for transfusion medicine, for God's sake. And it's allowed us to travel to very nice locations like this. But the primary aim has always been to heal the sick, alleviate suffering, and postpone death. Thank you very much indeed.